Today's lecture will somewhat extend from the lecture we had last time. We were talking about mass media and the impact that it has. We talked about a lot of the theories last time. So this time we'll be going on and talking about how the mass media is really impacting our modern society. This lecture perhaps is going to be slightly longer and slightly more thought-provoking. At least I sure hope it is, because I think there are a lot of things that you need to really ponder through. You need to set aside some time and just think about them afterwards as far as what are your mass media choices, why are they your choices, and once you make those decisions, how are they impacting you? All right, let's go ahead and get started then. Mass media in today's society. Some things that we need to recognize just as base background to start with, please. That the stats that were released in November of 2008, those are fairly recent, confirm that the influence of mass media print is declining steadily due to the internet, but social media is accelerating. Now, I don't think anybody would question that or be confused about that. I think we're all aware of the fact that newspapers as a whole, subscription numbers are going down, and yet the use of the internet is certainly escalating. Magazines, according to this study, magazines, that's a pretty significant drop from 23% to 18% of the population that they're impacting. TV is not done, it's down from 71 to 65%. That's a fairly significant drop, is it not? But there is one category in television that's up, and that's cable news. That's up from 47 to 49%. In other words, people are not as readily turning to ABC and NBC and CBS. They are turning more to your major cables, the CNN and the MSNBC and Fox News. Social networking site interaction has grown 98%. In that same amount of time where we saw the dipping of TV viewing and we saw the magazine subscriptions drop, yet social interaction up 98%. Just a complete explosion. And this article went on to say that in light of all this, a very intriguing thing has happened, and that is that peer-to-peer authority is replacing mass media on all fronts. As information sources, family and friends advice rose from 44% of those who said, I seek a family member's opinion. Now that's 48% or 47%. And coworkers, we used to go to them about 23% of the time, and now we're actually listening to them around 30% of the time. Now that is an intriguing factor, especially for those of you who are thinking about media and media marketing. If it is really the family advice and it really is the co-worker advice that people are turning to and people are listening to, then how can we best and how can we most effectively get our information out to that mass so that perhaps that family member then is impacting my future customer in a way that I am interested in? You say, well, Mrs. Morris, in light of that first slide, perhaps I don't need to study the mass media. I can simply say mass media is in certain ways going the way of the dinosaur, and I just pay attention to the internet. No, I think I would disagree with you there. We've said it before and we'll say it again. History tends to repeat itself. So we want to look at a few movements, things that we've seen. Why did certain movements occur and how are they impacting society as we see it? We do need to recognize that presidents have learned to use the media for mass impact. Presidents have. How do I say that? Well, in 32, Roosevelt utilized the radio to overshadow the press's print. He was a little bit upset with the press, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this lecture. And so what did he do? He went to the radio and started trying to do some weekly chats. Have you ever heard the president get on now and have his little 5-minute chat? Radio. In 48, Truman followed Roosevelt's successful use of radio and print, and during his presidency, he began using television as a major instrument of getting out what his ideals were, what he wanted to see done in the administration. In 52, when we had Eisenhower versus Stevenson, television, especially now the use of commercials, was highly successful, allowing candidates to gain instant access to the voting public. So notice just through the progression of mass media, we see a progression in how presidents are able to reach out and contact the just ordinary citizen out there and perhaps a future voter. In 62, you had the debates of Kennedy and Nixon, and they transformed how the debates were conducted. Those listening on the radio felt that Nixon was the clear-cut winner. But those who watched it declared Kennedy the winner, thus forever transforming audio and print to a visual market. Now, if you've never done any research on the Kennedy-Nixon debates, really need to go do that. I can just take a minute to talk to you about those. But really what became key here was Kennedy was completely exhausted. He was dealing with an awful lot in his administration. He was weary. He had not had a lot of rest. Kennedy was coming off of some time in the sun, so he was young, he had a healthy tan, and he was very photogenic, which is why those that listened on the radio listened for ideas and listened for concepts and listened for clear answers. So the radio listeners, hands down, gave it to Nixon because they were listening to content. But the television viewers viewed a very weary Nixon, and he had deep, heavy bags under his eyes. He just really looked quite bad. Kennedy's people knew how to use some really nice makeup, plus he had that tan. And so what happened was those watching television tended to look at the candidates rather than listen to the candidates. And that really was a huge transformation. In 90, Bush used the television to convince the Americans of the need to go to war with a country that had not yet directly attacked the U.S. At the time, we're dealing with Gulf War, right? And talking about Bush Sr. here. And I remember watching the pictures that he used, and it was an unbelievable format to be sitting in your living room and to see these pictures of some of the real genocide that had been occurring over in Iraq, and to see the pictures of the brutalized citizens, and to be deeply concerned. So this country had not come to America in 1990. They had not attacked us. But Bush Sr. used the medium of the television to convince us we need to go over there. We need to get involved. Finally, in 96, the internet became a tool for candidates Dole and Clinton. Do you see the progression that's going here? Wise candidates, wise campaigners understand how to reach the mass media. And then in 2008, we had Obama being one of the first ones who really used Facebook, and he got on there, and he was one of the first ones to get donations via the internet in just a really, really successful fashion. So if you look at that, notice how over time, as mass media changes, the strength of various mediums of mass media change, you see presidents learning how to effectively use that. Also, world leaders used mass media after the Twin Towers. Now, you're a little young. You may not remember all this, but just let me, again, we're laying some groundwork so that you can see how media definitely impacts the politics of America. But notice what happened on the Twin Towers. Afterwards, Bush gave a very famous speech entitled, "Why Do They Hate Us?" You need to go Google that and read it. It was a very powerful speech given very effectively. But there was not simply that. Then bin Laden had a response, and he used the media. He made videotapes. And within hours of the first wave of our soldiers looking at their attacks into Afghanistan and their approaches into Iraq, boy, he had made videotapes, and those were released, and they got out both on the internet and over some of the key television stations. Then bin Laden released a second videotape the next day, appealing for the unity of the Arabs and more terrorist strikes on the U.S. Again, he's going for the mass media. The U.S. began dropping the leaflets. Remember, we talked about how those were used in World War I and World War II, and here they are still being used. After the terrorists attacked the Twin Towers, they dropped those in Afghanistan, showing U.S. soldiers extending a hand to a man in Afghan dress. We are your friends. Do not believe what you're hearing from your leaders. We are your friends. Then the U.S. began to release radio broadcasts offering hope. If you will go ahead and surrender, we will not imprison you. If you give yourselves up, we will be your friend. In other words, we had a major situation and a war between two countries, and the mass media was used to try to extend the ideologies of each of those nations. Then, in a real surprising move to some of them, Newsweek printed the front page of the Four Freedoms. Now, do you know who drew those? Anybody familiar with those? One of my favorite artists. That's Norman Rockwell, and that had been on the cover of the Post magazine years and years and years before. And I believe it was during World War II that this was actually the first time that that was printed. But the freedoms, what do we fight for? For speech, for worship, from want. In other words, we don't want to be such a desperately poor country. And freedom from fear. And Newsweek reprinted that as the title cover on its magazine. But understand that the mass media can get it wrong. Obviously, here's Dewey holding the infamous newspaper that he had defeated Truman. Obviously, the next day, the newspapers that came out said a different story. And you know what? That still happened. Remember the Gore-Bush battle over Florida. It had really, this presidential election had been such a neck-and-neck race, and all the pundits were saying a lot of this will come down to Florida because Florida has so many electorate votes. And whoever can take Florida is probably ultimately going to be the winner of the entire race. Even though there were still a few other states to come in, Florida became crucial. So what happened? At 8 p.m., Peter Jennings of ABC News stated, quote, Al Gore wins the state of Florida and its 25 electoral votes. And so ABC began asserting Al Gore will be the next president of the United States. And they really jumped the guns. If you go do some research on that, ABC was doing exit polls. That's where you kind of stand outside of the polling areas, and then as people exit, you say, now, for whom did you vote? And are you Democrat or Republican? And oftentimes, exit polls can give a good understanding of what may happen. But ABC had not waited for enough information at all. And when they made that, they really had major egg on their face, as you know. The rest has happened. Throughout the night, then it became, oh, perhaps we spoke too early. And by 2 a.m. then, 6 hours later, they are saying George W. Bush now declared the 43rd President of the United States. And then NBC jumped on and projected that George Bush was going to win. Tom Brokaw reported, it's been a night of first giving it to Gore and then taking it away on the part of the network. So we do have to be mindful of the fact when the mass media tries to be, you know, a lot of times they just want to be the first one to get a story out. And when they try to do that, then they might get it out wrong. So you have to learn to be a wise discerner of the information. Is it credible? Is there enough research done behind it? Therefore, can I believe it? So let me give you a brief overview, and this is going to be very brief. We could just spend hours and hours on this, and this was another one of those lectures that I finally had to make myself stop and make this video because I could just research and research and research and research, and you know what, then you'd end up with a 3-hour lecture, and I don't think you want that. So I made myself quit. But as we look at some key aspects of mass media, just let me touch on a few of them, and then I hope that you'll go pick up a book and read it. All right? I want to whet your appetite. Well, one of the first major mass media components is the radio. We're familiar with that, and we're familiar how oftentimes initially that was a form of entertainment. People didn't have televisions in their houses, and they had the radio, and so oftentimes they would all gather around and they would listen to the radio. They would perhaps listen to one of the high school games, or they would listen to War of the Worlds, right? But understand that one of the very first key events in the history of radio was when David Sarnoff was a telegraph operator, and he was actually working on this, over the radio with this telegraph in the top story of a store, of a department store, and he began over the radio to hear the issues of the disaster. And for 72 hours, David Sarnoff sat there, and anytime any of the rescue boats or any of the other boats were giving any kind of a radio transmission, David was there, and for 72 hours, he really tried to listen and then disperse the information that he was hearing. He became quite a household name, and at that point, people began to realize radio is more than just entertainment. Radio can really be an effective tool for the disbursement of information that really is important. What I want you to start listening for is notice that as we get mediums, medium, a means of transportation, or I'm sorry, transmission of information across the mass media, watch how it oftentimes is a major event, something along that line that will buoy something up into being very, very successful. So for radio, it was really this whole situation with the Titanic. Then we moved along to the newspapers. Now, newspapers were different initially. Radio, you would have certain things that you had to listen to in the certain time frames, correct? But then you had these newspapers that came out, and you had a mix of content. You could have local news, and you could have advice columns, and comics. Even long ago, they may not have had the Peanuts, but they would have some funny drawings, some things that they could laugh about. You'd have opinions being written. Perhaps there were puzzles on there, and there were all kinds of data. And people learned to send newspapers cross country, perhaps to a loved one who was relocating, and they'd stick some newspapers on the train and have the train carry it across country so that their loved one could get a sense of what was going on back home. And for a lot of people, newspapers became almost an issue of comfort. You could come home from a busy day of work and just sit down with your newspaper and read through it and find out what was going on locally. You had newspaper begin to change when people said, hey, you know what, we really are intrigued by, if I get up in the morning, I want to know the news. And so newspapers went from just being an evening print to now you had the morning edition. And I can remember growing up, my father had the newspaper delivered, and I lived in a larger town, and we could choose, did we want the morning edition or did we want the afternoon edition? Now, USA Today had one of a major impact on newspapers, and that was based on, can you tell? Do you know why USA Today made such a big splash? It's because of how they used the visual medium of color and graphics, and they integrated all of that. If you just look at this, this is a very visually appealing front cover. Up until then, newspapers had been fairly just, black and white, perhaps one picture here and there, but USA Today really ramped it up. And if you track statistically the sales of USA Today, most analysts will say that USA Today is considered to be a second buy. In other words, you might buy your home newspaper. If I live in Watertown, I might purchase the Watertown Daily Times. But then if I'm out traveling and I'm going through the airport, I pick up a USA Today. Or if I'm traveling and there's a McDonald's and there's a USA Today. So it's actually the second buy, and it gives me perhaps a more global view. And what USA Today promises, we'll try to get something about every single state in the nation in there. You go to, they've got one page and they'll try to give little nuggets of every single state. That was very intriguing. Now, one of the issues for newspapers that's been a challenge for them is that young people, your generation, tends to have an aversion to newspaper. You're not that interested in sitting down and picking that up. And so, what are newspapers trying to do to adapt to that? Well, they're going online, and now you can buy your online subscriptions because that's where your generation is headed. Moving on to magazines. Were you aware that magazines really became popular in 1820? We tend to think of magazines as the current ones, and that's true, but their history goes way back in the history of America. And really one of the intriguing things about magazines is that they really were primarily sold because people could not afford books. there just wasn't that discretionary fund available. And so the Saturday Evening Post, and if you look very closely, I tried to find a picture of a young boy selling the Saturday Evening Post, and I was able to come up with that, carried short stories, and sometimes they had serialized novels. Now, that means they gave like a chapter 1, and then tomorrow was chapter 2, and the next day was chapter 3. And they actually had very famous authors they used. Did you know that Edgar Allan Poe put his things serially in the newspaper? So did Nathaniel Hawthorne. So did Harriet Beecher Stowe. Now, they'd been doing that over in England for years. Charles Dickens had been publishing his novels by chapters for years. But it came over to America, and America began doing their own famous authors in such a way. And because magazines became so famous and because people were buying them, the U.S. government actually took a look at that and said, you know what? The ability of people to get their hands on magazines helps literacy because we're actually publishing novels. And that's what really helped promote the United States Postal Act of 1879. And what that did is it allowed for discounted mailing rates. They paid a penny a pound to mail out magazines. Can you imagine? Now, let me show you how magazines have kind of morphed through the years, all right? Initially, you had magazines that they really did a lot of focus on investigative reporting, and that's really what got Roosevelt upset, though. Because remember the term muckraking? You may have heard that in your history classes. And that was the term that was used because Roosevelt said, you know what, journalists are just raking mud. They are trying to cause problems. They are just trying to stir up issues. And that's why, remember, he started doing a lot on the radio. He kind of wanted to change the venue for which he was getting his information out. But what it really did was, this really solidified in the minds of a lot of people the powerful medium that magazines had for shaping public policy. Then you moved on to photojournalism through the years. And you had Harper's Weekly being one of the first, not necessarily the first, but one of the first, to send artists to draw Civil War battles. You have some photos of Civil Wars, but they couldn't necessarily get those photos printed that quickly. So Harper's Weekly would go, and they would send artists, and they would actually sit and watch a battle, can you imagine, and then draw a picture of the battle. That was photojournalism. Then you had consumer magazines start coming into play. That was basically your general interest magazine, like a Reader's Digest, where you're trying to have something, you don't want something for everyone. You're kind of having a narrower focus. And those who started Reader's Digest said, quite frankly, our goal is to create a magazine that's a little lighter, that when people read it, they walk away a little bit happier. You know, you have a lot of sections of Reader's Digest that are very inspirational stories, stories about people who've had a very difficult time and they overcame a challenge. You'll have jokes, right? The whole goal of Reader's Digest was just a little more lighthearted. Then you moved on to your news magazines that really wanted to focus on what's the news of the day, what's the sports of the day, what are the politics of the day, what are the business of the day. Time was actually founded in 1923, so that's an older magazine that has made it through the years. And if you know anything about Time, though, they do tend to have a liberal bent. You just have to recognize they can have some good journalistic reporting, but you have to understand the scope through which they are presenting it. And one of the final ones that we've seen are trade journals. Trade journals, they're just trying to keep up to date on current happenings in a specific field. Now, trade magazines, notice, are more they are more targeted. They have a specific target audience. Perhaps you've read the magazine Electronic Media. If you're a doctor, you've got JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. In other words, the trade magazine has a very focused group to which it is writing. And through the years, what magazines have found are that the magazines that tend to make it are the magazines that are having the more focused view. When they know their target audience, because it helps them in what way? You know? Helps them with their ad sales. If you can go to somebody and say, this is our readership and these people are always interested in XYZ, therefore you should put your specific item in there. You know, if I'm going to read, perhaps I'm going to read a hunter's magazine. Well, they're probably not going to have a whole lot of ads for dishwashers in there, right? You're going to find that in a different kind of magazine. So through the years, magazines have had a great impact on American culture. Then we move on to movies. Now, whether this is not a discussion on whether or not we like movies, we go to movies, that's not what I want you to focus on. But note this. John Vivian said, a movie is an all-encompassing experience which has driven perceptions. Some are accurate, some perceptions are overstated. But the power of movies is real, and the power of movies can shape cultural values. That's what I want you to focus on, crew. The movies can shape cultural values. Now, let me go back in time just a tad. There's an old movie. I believe it or not, I've never even seen this one, so I can't say whether or not it's good or bad. But in 1934, Clark Gable, one of the Hollywood stars of the day, believe it or not, was in this movie called It Happened One Night. And in the movie, he took off his shirt. Now, that was just scandalous back in 1934. And to make matters worse, Clark Gable did not have any kind of a T-shirt on underneath. Now, so people were just, oh my, what is going on? But you know what was very interesting that I don't think anybody in the movie theater had ever even considered was that nationwide, the sales of men's undershirts plummeted in the next year. And you say, well, Mrs. Morris, that's just trivial. I mean, who cares whether or not a man wears a T-shirt? I agree with you, okay? But what it can help us understand is that a movie can have a very powerful cultural experience. Nowadays, a certain movie star wears her hair a certain way, and girls run out and they have to have that exact same haircut, right? Or, you'll see a particular car in a particular movie, and suddenly the sale of that car skyrockets. In movies, there are, if you really watch and if you've done studies and perhaps open your eyes to this, it's called item placement. And in the movie E.T., they initially had gone to some different candies saying, would you like to put your candy in this movie? We're going to have this little alien dude. He's going to be eating some candy, and would you like to put it? And there were some candies that turned them down. And if you've ever seen E.T., it was the Reese's peanut butter candies that said yes. And following E.T., the sales of Reese's peanut butter, those little itty-bitty, round ones, really escalated. Why? Because the children had seen E.T. eating those, and so they had to have their parents go out and buy them. All right, fast forward to just a couple years ago. Director Ang Lee. Does that name strike any note of understanding or recognition? Perhaps not. Sadly, this is the man who directed a movie called Brokeback Mountain. Now, Brokeback Mountain, I've never seen it. Don't necessarily have a desire to. But what he did was he presented the homosexual lifestyle in a very, very sympathetic viewpoint. And because of that, you had people turning around saying, oh, well, perhaps the homosexual lifestyle isn't quite so bad. Perhaps we should embrace it and be more accepting. Again, let me take you back to movies can have a very powerful cultural influence. Then we move on to sound recordings. Why? Because sound recordings are now, especially for your generation, just at the tip of a fingertip. And I know I've got some things here that, represent the sound recording and everything that can be done with it. You can download things. You can store things. You can have them in tiny, tiny little gadgets that are smaller than a wallet-sized credit card. Absolutely amazing. Couldn't do that 25 years ago. I thought that the portable CD player was a really major breakthrough. And now on demand, we can work our way through various styles of music. Now, the internet has allowed for this, right? So we're moving through from radio to magazines to television to movies. Now we have the internet. Most of you probably can't even remember life without the internet. I remember the first time I sent an email, went up to my husband's office, and he typed something and he said, "Now, honey, watch this." And he clicked it and he said, "I just sent it. It's gone." That was mind-boggling to me. And yet, my kids don't know life without email. They don't know life, without iPods. It's all they have grown accustomed to. But let me ask you this. Uh, does this young man, Sean Fanning, does that name mean anything to any of you? Let me give you one more visual and see if this helps you. Sean Fanning created Napster. Right? He said, look, people want to have music. They want to share music. And I'm just going to create a means by which they can enjoy this and they can share with friends. Obviously, the recording industry was very, very upset. They said, that's not fair because we've got people who are trying to write music, bad music, good music, any kind of music, who are not then receiving their royalties. This obviously went to court. The recording industry prevailed. Napster at the time was put out of business. But you had other, what they call P2P, the peer-to-peer sharing sites that imitated Napster. You had Grokster. They came up and they were facilitating free downloads. And in 1 week, in 2005, the recording industry says that CD sales were down 28%. They said a lot of that was because of these free sharing websites. And that's why in 2005, the Supreme Court did, again, shut down some of these free sharing sites. That has become an issue of conversation. So where does free speech end for the internet? Now, I want to talk through some more philosophical things. All right? I'm going to go backwards to Karl Marx. And I really want you to put your thinking caps on for the next few slides, all right? Most of you are familiar with Karl Marx. I would say I disagreed with Karl Marx in most of his ideology, but one of his key things was that he wanted to present unquestioned assumptions, which would be adopted by the ordinary people, because he felt that the ordinary people, the uneducated people, could be convinced to act and to hold beliefs when they were not even aware of how they were just being drawn in. Let me read through that once more and think through it. Try to write this down. Karl Marx, about the media, he wanted to present unquestioned assumptions which would be adopted by the ordinary people, because they, the ordinary people, could be convinced to act and to hold beliefs that they're not even aware of. A couple key things I want you to note. One was the unquestioned assumption. Folks, it is just crucial that you learn to be thinkers, that you learn to be questioners, that you are not just presented with something and you don't just say, oh, that sounds, they were a very good speaker. I think I should believe that. You cannot fall into the trap of merely being a sponge. You have to learn to really think through things. Why? Because notice what he says just a couple lines down. Because the ordinary people can be convinced to act and to hold a belief that they normally were not even aware of. Karl Marx understood the power of the media. And you say, well, Mrs. Morris, the media is objective. I would just say it is not. Richard Salent, who was the former president of CBS, not merely an anchor, said, our job is to give people not what they want, but what we decide they ought to have. That is a scary comment. Our job is to give people not what they want, but what we decide they ought to have. That's the president of major TV. When I talk to people, it's amazing. Sometimes I'll say, that they have an agenda. Oh, no. Those are just news people. ABC has an agenda. CBS has an agenda. NBC has an agenda. CNN has an agenda. Fox News has an agenda. That's what I watch, but at least Fox News lets you know they have an agenda. They don't try to hold it. MSNBC is very liberal. They have an agenda. Just watch. Start watching. How do they present? What do they talk about? What do they leave off? Okay? The media, folks, is no longer objective, and you have to learn to sift through those stories. Dan Rather, and one of the reasons that he went down in infamy, he did not go down really well respected. He began presenting stories that had not really been researched. He said of Mr. Salient that Mr. Salient wrote the book on integrity and ethics and excellence. And I say, well, then that is scary, because Mr. Salient was the man on the previous slide who said, we need to tell the people what we think is important. Now, no longer are they presenting the news objectively and saying, you figure it out. Now they're presenting a one-sided photo. So, in our field, we want to be able to make generalizations about the way people communicate and the effects of these communications. We're going to talk about just a few key aspects of communication and recognize that who controls the means of the media production is so crucial. Why were people very, very upset when Murdoch bought out the Wall Street Journal? Does the name Murdoch mean anything to you? Do you know what other medium Murdoch uses to get his ideals out? Murdoch is the primary holder of Fox News. And so when Murdoch bought out the Wall Street Journal, one of the most well-respected newspapers in America, some of the liberals went up in arms. Oh no, Murdoch bought it out. Why? Because they know that there's a good chance Murdoch will hire more conservative news reporters. Marxist theorists, we've talked about Marx before, Karl Marx, insist that the owners of the means of cultural production will produce cultural ideologies that express corporate values and general outlook. And I think we would concur with that, would we not? Those who own the cultural production, those who own the CNNs, those who own the Fox News, those who own ABC, they are going to present their values. They're going to present their cultural ideologies. So let me ask you this. Will you, or would you think that NBC would ever be able to really objectively break an investigative news report on toxic waste dumps that were owned by GE? Do you think that NBC would be able to do that? Because, hey, that's one of the big three, right? Big three being NBC, CBS, and ABC. And though they're very frustrated, again, that cable stations have really taken their viewership. But do you think that NBC would be able to do that? My answer would be probably not, because GE owns NBC. And that's why you'll have some people saying, you know what, we don't want all these mega corporations buying out all the news places. Why? Because please give us some semblance of reality as it is. Now, postmodernism. Believe it or not, that's probably a theory that you're all familiar with, but it does impact the media. How so? Well, let me give you a quick overview. Postmodernism, in a real sense, remember, states there are no absolutes. What's good for me is okay. What's good for you is okay. But there are really no absolutes. That's why there cannot be absolute good and absolute evil. There cannot be a Bible which states there's only one way to heaven, because that would be an absolute. I believe in absolutes, but postmodernism says no, there really aren't. Postmodernism would also assert, please stop judging, because that's just not right. There's no simple explanation for everything, and so you live your life, and I'll live my life, and if it doesn't impact me personally, then maybe it's really not an issue. Everything's just okay. A lot of really scary things here. If there are no absolutes, then really, how can we send people to jail anymore? Right? If there's really not an absolute right and wrong. And if it's good for me and it's okay, then if I were a postmodernist thinker, you know what? I could go get stoned. I could go use all kinds of drugs because, hey, it made me feel better. And you know what? I really don't need to have a lifestyle that promotes morality. If I want to change partners every 5 weeks into my marriage, that's good for me, and a postmodernist might say that works. Okay, so we're dealing with some heavy-duty topics here, but isn't it true that this is what we see in the media? Do you see shows that have no absolutes? Do you see shows that suggest if it's okay for me, it's okay? I can use the foul language, I can dress inappropriately, right? Do you see shows where you've got people being unfaithful to their marriage vows? Why? Don't judge. Don't judge. You know, how a show like Desperate Housewives, I've never watched it, I never desire to, but how that can be so popular when it just deals with immorality between married couples, that just grieves me. But then you've got people saying, but if it doesn't impact me, then maybe it's not a real issue. And see, that becomes an issue where, unfortunately, in the American culture, sometimes we'll have more stories about, who got to visit whom in jail instead of who's paying attention to the genocides that are going on over in Africa. Might have people say, well, it doesn't impact me, so I really don't care. Well, that's tragic, because tragedy and humanity should impact us far more than who got out of going to jail just because of their daddy's last name. Postmodernists love the label, and yet they don't want you to label them as postmodernists. It's our word. Don't use it. Don't try to define it. And above all, don't label us with it, even if we apply it to ourselves. Why? Because there are no absolutes. So stop judging me, because if it's good for me, then it's okay. So how does this impact media? Very strongly. Did you know that some news agencies, after the terrorist attacks, refused to use the word terrorism in news stories? Instead, it was suggested to use terms such as the resistance or man-caused disaster. That blew my mind. President Barack Obama's Homeland Security, head of Homeland Security, gave a speech and did not use the term terrorist, but instead used the term man-caused disaster. And when asked about it, the response was, well, we just don't want to put people into a heightened sense of fear. Wow. Wow. Andreas Saugstad, who's the author of the blog Postmodernism in the Media, said, we live in a time where fame without content is dominating. People are getting famous because of nothing. And instead of making educational and cultural programs, TV stations make trash TV because of the commercial value. In other words, I'm going to create a new show, not based on does society need it, but can I sell the ads, stick into my own pocket if I own this station. I am really happy for people who lose weight. I really, really am. But I am amazed at this love affair that America has at watching it. Because in some ways, isn't it ironic? You've got a bunch of people who want to lose weight. I'm very proud of them for losing weight, don't get me wrong. But then what happens? The Americans sit around on their couches eating their potato chips and their candy bars and gaining weight as they watch people lose weight. Do we no longer have books to read? No longer have people to correspond with? Waste of time. Moving on, so we've got postmodernism and how it impacts the media. Then you've got feminism in the media, which is very clearly an issue nowadays. Liberal humanist feminists aim to extend to women the rights already possessed by men. They work for equality within the present system. And you might say, well, Mrs. Morris, more power to the women. Now, wait a minute. Read this whole quote, please. Radical feminists advocate the revolutionary transformation of society and the development of alternative social arrangements to those currently in place. Meaning, lesbians are okay. Marxist or socialist feminists. Now notice they've coupled those. Marxist or social feminists see the capitalistic economic structure as at the root of women's oppression. Lesbian feminists see heterosexuality as a primary cornerstone of male supremacy. Women do not need to define themselves by their relation to male world. And I did not make that up, but I found that on the website Feminist Theory. Understand how the media is being used to promote feminism. Very, very, very true. Hence, you have Will and Grace, the whole homosexual agenda going there. And you have Ellen, one of the first open lesbians, and now, quite a comedian. She is a funny gal. I can't watch her because I know what she believes, and I know what she stands for, and I know what she wants to undermine, biblically speaking. I think that we just need to pray for them. So, what's so important about understanding modern media? We have really had quite an impact here as we've watched the history and some of the things. There are 3 key things that I really want to leave you with, okay? First of all, recognize that the people's choice of media are dependent upon their selective goals. What do I need? What do I need? I want you to write that down. This is what's known as the uses and gratification theory, by the way. Uses and gratification theory. Sorry, I just cannot keep my headphones on. My ears have shrunk. Okay, the uses and gratification theory. That says that people's choices of media are dependent upon their motive. So, notice the Twin Towers. What was a fascinating research was, after the Twin Towers, and to which people were just glued to the TV, right? They could not get enough of it because of the fear. We were not all in New York when it happened, and we needed to know what was going on. And several media, ABC, CBS, NBC, several of them just stopped all of their programming. So you could not see any of the shows, and it was nonstop 24/7 news because this was major. And people realized, whew, this is heavy stuff. The research done in the months after 9/11 found, can you guess what the primary genre that began to be made and enjoyed by the American society was? Comedy. American society needed to laugh. They had been through a desperate situation. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Doesn't Scripture tell us that a merry heart doeth good like a medicine? And so comedy became the key new series and the key movies that were out there. They were not the heavy and the desperate. They were the drama of comedy. So, uses and gratification then, thinking about that, because what I want you to do, crew, is I want you to think through, why am I watching what I'm watching? So when I go onto YouTube, what is it? Am I after, just a hard day of work, and I need to just brain freeze it out? What you've got to be careful of is, am I going there and just wasting time? Do I have a need? Because you know what? It's just easy to waste time, isn't it? You can go onto YouTube and just waste time. You can go onto Google and just waste time. Be careful. Second thing that I need you to recognize, what's important, is that no single perspective or theory completely and accurately captures the media, society, individual relationship. That's why we've been having all these different theories come through. Because you've got theories and all of them have good concepts, but when you want to look at the whole relationship, you've got a theory and this aspect is good, and then over here this aspect is good, and then over here this aspect is good. And when you want to look at the whole, there are small chunks of every single theory that help us understand the media and its power. Finally, there's no particular theory or perspective founded on firm evidence that should be ignored. In other words, if we've got the evidence to support it, we really can't just throw out the window nonverbal communication. That's one that's coming up. We haven't discussed it yet, and we will. But if there's evidence, then we need to give it meaningful thought. All right? There's not one single theory that will totally explain everything. It's going to be bits and pieces of all these theories that will help us have a big global understanding. And I'm going to leave you with this. Professor Weiss of the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater said that the media can be viewed in one of 2 ways. It's either a mirror reflecting our own reality, or it's a crystal ball reflecting what our life could be. That's intriguing. Is it a mirror reflecting reality to us, or is it a crystal ball reflecting what our life could be? And maybe that would be good, maybe that would be bad. And depending on the day, the pendulum or the teeter-totter might swing one way or the other. Again, going back to all those reality shows. There are reality shows about people who own bakery shops. Well, is that a mirror of what our life is? Well, not me. I don't own a bakery shop. But is it a reflection of what my life could be? Yeah, maybe if I went into business for myself and I could see some of the issues at hand. But you know what? Depending on the time of day, depending on the day of the week, that teeter-totter might go a different direction. In other words, when I'm 10 and I watch something, perhaps it is a mirror reflecting what my life really is. But when I'm 20, perhaps it's that crystal ball that reflected what my life has become. In other words, there really is no such thing as media that is just for entertainment. If there's anything I want you to walk away with today, I want you to recognize all media has an agenda. Every channel has an agenda. Every magazine has an agenda. Every radio station has an agenda. There is power in the media, and there are agendas in the media. That doesn't mean that we escape from it, but we have to analyze the information accordingly. And we dare not waste all of our time, because what does Scripture tell us? Redeeming the time, because the days are evil. Let it not be said of us in heaven someday that we just spent too much time, complete wastefulness, because we had the media at our fingertips. I hope this has been good for you. Listen, so much is available. Be careful. Use it wisely. Alrighty, have a good and godly day. For what lasting value is a good day if it's not also godly? We'll see you. Bye-bye.